Paul expresses most thoroughly, comprehensively, in a mature and balanced way his theological understanding, his gospel. And he's doing it for many reasons, in part because the community is divided, or there are tensions within the community. What seems to have happened, the Emperor Claudius had, because of some agitation in the Roman Jewish community, there are Roman historians' accounts of this that are a bit garbled. It says at the instigation of one Chrestus, I think probably the proclamation of Christ among the Roman in the Roman Jewish community had led to some debate and tension. Claudius issued an edict banishing Jews from Rome. And then when he died, the Emperor Nero, that wonderful gentleman, lifted that ban, and so Jews could return to Rome. Well, in the meantime, the Christian groups, the household-based churches in Rome, had shifted from a much more Jewish composition to a non-Jewish, a Gentile composition. So then as Jewish Christ believers are returning to Rome, there were some tensions, there were differing practices and understandings. So in part what Paul is doing in Romans is helping to bring these groups together to being one again. And so the latter part of the letter is very interesting, Romans 14 and 15. He's addressing very practical, concrete things like what meats, what foods we eat, how our eating practices can be a dividing thing, but he wants the Roman Christian group to get past that to being one. Don't pass judgment on one another, he says, for these differing practices. Well, as he moves on toward the end of his discussion in chapter 15, verse 7, he says, welcome one another, therefore, just as Christ has welcomed you for the glory of God. And so he holds up the example, if you will, the hospitality of Christ as the basic model, pattern for being church. And I just thought that would be, this church is in transition, leadership transition, and just reminder that at the core of our identity is core in early Christian practice of faith and life together is this generous, welcoming hospitality, even across differences of background and culture and so on. So it's a nice reminder to us today. The theme as we get into 1 Peter in a moment is, as we're going to see, very much reflection on the experience of suffering, which you Tar Heel fans can relate to. At least today, maybe not generally. And Paul addresses this in Romans in a very, I think, helpful way, and so I wanted to link back to Romans in a way that would prepare for our discussion of 1 Peter. In Romans 5, Paul has made a case. He believes that the human condition, unaided, is helpless, is powerless. The powerful reality of sin, which turns people away from the life God intends for us. The power of that is such that only God can set us right. And so in the first part of the letter, he's sketched in pretty, his diagnosis of the human story, the human patient, is pretty unsparing in the first part of Romans. But then he makes a case that through Christ, God, as a gracious gift, because God is God, because God is righteous. God is so righteous that God can make righteous, God can put right even sinful human beings who are God's enemies, at the very point of our powerlessness to help ourselves. So gospel, that's at the core of Paul's understanding of the gospel. So then he begins to reflect on the implications, the effects, the results of this as he moves into chapter 5. So he talks about reconciliation, how those who are enemies of God have been made friends, so to say, friends brought to peace with God. So in that move to reconciliation at the start of chapter 5, Therefore, since we are justified by faith, since we are put in right relation to God by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we've obtained access to this grace in which we stand. So we've been brought into God's kind, gracious favor. Undeserved, but that is where we have been placed. And we boast in our hope of sharing the glory of God. Generally, Paul says boasting is not something we do. Certainly boasting in our own capacity. But here it says there is a kind of boasting. It's okay. We boast in our hope of sharing the glory of God. And not only that, we also, could translate we even, boast in our sufferings. I think maybe a better translation would be in the midst of our sufferings, because we're not boasting in the fact that we're suffering, but while we're experiencing hardship, nevertheless we have this confidence. We boast in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance, character, hope. And hope does not disappoint us. NRSV, put to shame would be a more literal translation. We're not going to be ashamed because of the reality of suffering, despite what it might look like. So we boast in our sufferings, knowing suffering produces endurance, character, and character, hope. And hope does not put to shame or disappoint us, because God's love has been poured out in our hearts through the Holy Spirit that has been given to us. And then Paul goes on to picture the self-surrender, the self-giving of Jesus to make human beings right, even in their godless, sinful, and powerless state. While we were yet sinners, Christ died for us as the expression of God's love for us. And so Paul says that's why we have confident trust in the face of the worst that life throws at us, because God's love for us is so real, is so sure. And it's evident in our experience of God's very presence through the Holy Spirit. So in chapter 5, he makes a case that even in the worst that life can give us, we can experience that kind of confident assurance and hope. He returns to the theme in chapter 8, so before he moves into an extended discussion of the future of Israel. You know, Paul's in anguish because his fellow Jews are not enthusiastically embracing the gospel. And yet he believes God's call to Israel is real, and God doesn't simply walk away from God's promises. So he really reflects in some anguish about that in chapters 9 to 11. But before he makes that turn, he returns to this theme of suffering and hope. And I wanted to mention that passage as well. So in the middle of chapter 8, verse 18, Paul says, I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing to the glory that is about to be revealed to us. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the children of God. Creation was subjected to futility, not of its own will, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in the hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay and will obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning in labor pains until now. And not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly while we wait for adoption. Probably Jennifer worked with this metaphor of adoption last week. Adoption is God's very children, the redemption of our bodies. For in hope we were saved. Now, hope that is seen is not hope. Who hopes for what is seen? If you already see it, if you already have it, there's no reason for hope. You hope because you haven't lived into that reality yet. But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience. Then he gives us the image of the Spirit, who is with us in our weakness, even when we don't have words to pray. The Spirit within us prays on our behalf. So God's presence calls forth prayers from And then he talks about God's very faithfulness to bring good out of all things for those who love God, and so on. And then this just magnificent passage at the close of chapter 8, which is often read in funeral services. If God is for us, who is against us, and so on, concludes with this image: no matter what life throws you, time, future, universe, hardship, whatever you experience, nothing has any power to separate from the love of God in Christ Jesus. And so you see again the affirmation that Paul gives us that our deepest suffering is not the last word. That even in the midst of suffering, we know God's love for us, which will see us through it all. And in that, therefore, we hope, and nothing can separate us from that powerful love. So we, people of faith, but notice that we're part of a whole creation. You know, that Paul thinks God's concern is cosmic, universal. That it's not just persons of faith, but it's the whole world of God's good creation that is in the midst of this process of a birthing of a new creation. A new creation filled with, marked by God's love. So whatever else I say today as we get into 1 Peter, it's kind of hard to dig deeper than that. You read enough in Paul's letters, you know that he's not just thinking in the abstract here. He has, in 2 Corinthians, a list of the hardships he's endured: imprisonments, shipwrecks, beatings, as an apostle, as a missionary for the gospel. So he knows the reality of suffering. It's not just theoretical or abstract. Nevertheless, he has this confident trust in God. And so in Philippians, you know, he can say, I've learned to be content in all circumstances. Wanted to make one other comment about context before we turn to 1 Peter. Actually, probably two comments. And one is about the reality in life in the first century, and the other is about the reality in the world today as we think about human limitation, finitude, hardship, suffering. In terms of the first century, it's just helpful sometimes to remind ourselves, because whatever the problems with our healthcare system, you know, we have a lot of advantages in terms of dealing with illness and suffering that's often related to it. First century in Paul's world, you know, if you lived into your 20s, you were fortunate. No antibiotics, you know, skill of surgeons and so on. There were folks who practiced the medical trade, but they didn't have access to the knowledge and the skill that we have today. So if you became ill, it might well be an illness that led to your death. Families had to deal with the grieving over young children who died, or mothers dying in childbirth. But this was so much the reality. So sometimes it's helpful to remind ourselves that that's the world that Paul knew, and the world of the folks he wrote to. The average life expectancy was probably somewhere around 18. So if you were privileged, I mean, just think also about conditions of sanitation, hygiene in those crowded cities, unclean water, and so on. So suffering was very much at the center of the experience of life. So remind ourselves of that. But also in terms of our own world, Christian people live for the most part in a very blessed and privileged place in our culture. We're not persecuted, most of us, for our Christian commitment, but it's not the case in some parts of the world. And so to remind ourselves also of that, so things that maybe Paul says, or 1 Peter will say about suffering, or the book of Revelation will say about suffering, because one is a Christian. So not just suffering because it's part of the rhythm of life, about suffering precisely because of your faith commitment and your willingness to express that publicly. So there are folks in the Christian communion around the world who know that reality today. Just to remind ourselves of that. So even if it isn't our immediate experience, to be in solidarity with brothers and sisters in the Christian faith in other parts of the world. So, shall we make the turn? I do want to, invite comments, questions. So maybe this would be a good place just to pause for a moment before we turn to 1 Peter and see if there's some thoughts before we move on. I want to make sure that even those of you who were not able to be here next week have a little flavor of Paul's letter to the Romans. This will also buy me time to finish my call. By the way, I think the reason I emphasize not boasting in suffering, but boasting in the context of suffering, in the midst of suffering, why that nuance might be important, and this ladder that Paul gives us, the step ladder from suffering to character to hope. It almost sounds like it's an automatic thing. And so somehow if you experience suffering, you should get right to the hope, and you should feel just really okay and happy about the suffering you're experiencing. That's not what Paul's saying. He's saying because God is gracious, because God is loving, because God has shown the depths of God's love and care for us, even in the worst suffering, we have the possibility of real hope.
Do you think that because there was suffering for their faith, that their faith was much more a vital experience in their life and much more energetic?
That's the other side. When you have made a commitment that maybe has changed your way of relating to your peers, your neighbors, your co-workers, your family, and then you've experienced real hardship because of your faith. Would it, rather than, I think that we think, it would lead one really to just to walk away, right? But maybe it would help you to deepen and strengthen faith. And we'll see in 1 Peter, that's one of the ways in which that author helps us to make sense of suffering, that it can test, to be sure, but also provide opportunity for strengthening of faith.
I was in China some years ago, met with a group of the underground church.
Yes.
Who had suffered a great deal for their faith. Many of them, in fact, all of the people I was with had been in jail multiple times for their faith. I asked them what they feared most. They said, becoming like you. And
so that's powerful testimony, that the complacency that can come when it's just as easy. Now I think if you live long enough, that life isn't really easy. but yeah, that's a powerful testimony. Yes.
Well, this is not from the letters, but I don't know much about Ananias. I mean, how did he anticipate Paul? How did he know he was coming? Why was the Lord so cryptic as to say, go and they'll tell you what you need to know? I mean, the story's kind of brief.
Right, and in Acts 9, so we have God's recruitment of Paul the enemy, right, or Saul as he's called at that point in the narrative. God recruits the enemy of the way to become a leading proclaimer. So, and I think Ananias' role in Acts 9 is fascinating. So in part, what's interesting, so God gives this, on the theme of suffering, God reveals to Paul, called Saul then, that his future is going to entail witness to powerful people, but also suffering. How much he must suffer for the name of Christ. It's interesting that Ananias is the one who hears that message from God, and Ananias is the one who speaks it to Paul. It's a very interesting, if you will, narrator's decision, as Luke has put this narrative together. So Ananias' role, see what's going on there? Ananias mediates to an enemy whom he should fear the message about what God's plans for Paul are. So I think it's part of this emphasis in Luke's narrative that whatever human beings might contrive and intend, that God's will is going to move the story, is going to move the history. God's purposes will be accomplished even over and against, strong opposition. And so it's very interesting that Ananias then takes a key role, but the Spirit Acts emphasizes in a number of ways, either dreams, visions, or experience of angels or the Spirit, all these ways in which God's presence makes a difference in the story. So helps to bring Paul. And then Barnabas has to enter the story because they're still pretty scared and distrusting Paul. After all, he's been persecuting the early followers of Christ. So Barnabas needs to come in and bring him in and say, he's okay. God can use him. Not that helps, but thank you for bringing that up. Yes, sir.
My hearing denies me the opportunity, good fortune of hearing everything you said. But before you buttoned your jacket, my attention was also distracted by what's on the bottom of your tie.
Yes.
It's the black cat, Chat Noir.
What is it?
Chat Noir is the black cat. It's actually, I was in Paris in 2008, and this was a big thing in Paris. Apologies for the distraction. I know that entailed considerable suffering. But character is going to emerge from it, if not hope. Well, let's move on into 1 Peter. I have identified as a general theme faith under pressure. So it's suffering of a particular character now in 1 Peter. It's a suffering that people of faith in Peter's world are experiencing in a hostile society. I don't know if you can see this very well. This is the western part of what is today Turkey, so Asia Minor. So here's Ephesus. Corinth would be over here across the sea. Here is the province of Asia, Bithynia, Pontus, Galatia, and then as we move east, Cappadocia. So that's the eastern part of what is Turkey today. So we'll see that the letter of 1 Peter is written to Christian people living in that part of the world. So the letter is addressed to exiles of the diaspora. And one of a very creative interpretation of 1 Peter is in a book by Eliot called Home for the Homeless. So this idea that 1 Peter is writing to people who are not really at home in the world. They're aliens in a strange land. For 1 Peter, in part that's because their true homeland is the world God has prepared for them. But the other is that the world as they're experiencing it is a harsh place. And I don't mean just because life is tough. I mean because their faith has brought them into conflict with their culture, with their neighbors. So a central thread that runs throughout 1 Peter is concern for Christian people whose very identity, once made public and lived out publicly, their very identity as Christians, as Christ people, has brought opposition, has brought ridicule, has brought harassment, has brought trouble. So the interest of the letter as a whole is to strengthen and support and nurture, to sustain enduring Christian commitment, even when it's tough. Now, it's interesting to compare 1 Peter. 1 Peter, obviously the Peter we're talking about, the letter is associated with Simon Peter, pillar apostle of Jesus. Scholars, so it's a pretty sophisticated cultured Greek that you all would have read for today in your preparation. So scholars debate whether it really could come from Peter or if it's simply connected with the Peter tradition. But in any case, 1 Peter, and there is, as you could guess, a 2 Peter, also in the New Testament. 1 Peter, probably, folks think it's written maybe about the mid-60s as a guess, or later. And if you know your Roman history, you know that something pretty unhappy for Christians living in Rome happened in 64. So the Emperor Nero, whom I mentioned earlier, scapegoated Christian people in Rome and had just in huge numbers had them brutally executed. So that's part of the recent history, right? It was not true that the Roman Empire systematically persecuted Christians in this period. It's more sporadic. It's in locations here and there. And it's really more the form of these people arousing suspicion, being the victim of harassment and ridicule. But it could occasionally rise to the point of seizure and death. Accusation before local Roman officials and death could happen. And so in the book of Revelation, toward the end of the first century probably, if this isn't already the reality, the author John of Revelation is convinced it's come in sin. And what John does in Revelation is try, if you will, to recruit a few good witnesses who will live their faith out there in public way, even if it invites reprisal, opposition, persecution from Rome, and death. So Rome is the beast, not the promoter of peace and justice, but really the opponent of God's ways. And yet, John wants Christian people to live their faith boldly, courageously, publicly. Anyway, so like 1 Peter, the book of Revelation has this context of challenge and difficulty in the Roman Empire. But 1 Peter affirms a much more positive view still of the empire. 1 Peter 2, he will say, revere God, honor the emperor. Just right next to each other, these admonitions. So fear God, revere God, honor the emperor. When you come to Revelation, the Roman Empire becomes a menacing beast that we should not trust. We should disengage. Yes, sir.
Back to Nero for a second. A lot of the emperors at that time considered themselves God. Was he one of them?
Well, generally, the emperors in the eastern part of the empire. There was a tradition. There was a practice that was very customary to honor the ruling emperor as a deity, as divine. There was a little bit more discomfort about that in Rome, and so there was a tendency more to talk about certainly Rome as a goddess, and the imperial family. So the deceased emperor, the divine status of that person. So what exactly Nero thought about himself, what he insisted that others proclaimed, I'm not sure. And there are debates about Domitian, who was probably the emperor when Revelation was written. There have been folks who have thought, they've seen in the literature, that he insisted that folks call him Lord and God. And so what we need to get our heads around, we have a little less trust and maybe more skepticism about our political leaders. But in the Roman Empire, to honor the deity or the divine, no comments about any individuals, the divine status of the ruling emperor, the family of the emperor, and so on, that theological conviction is an expression of political loyalty. And if you didn't participate in the imperial cult in your region, honoring the deity of the the emperor and the imperial system, then you raise suspicions about your loyalty to Rome. So that is part of the reality. And it so happens that in the map that I had up, the region that First Peter is addressing, and that the book of Revelation is addressed to, is the area where the cities were competing with one another for the best, most honored shrine to Rome and to the imperial family. So Christian and Jewish people could not participate in that. Other people generally in the society could participate because there was room for one other god. And if it's a way of expressing loyalty to Rome and then getting benefit in return, Rome's generous sharing of prosperity with your city, why not, right? But Christian and Jewish people could not participate in that way. And that's part of the problem. It's one of the ways in which you become publicly known as a Christ person. So it invites risk in ways that, at least in the United States context, we don't have direct experience of. Well, let's see what 1 Peter has to say about this problem. So the interest is fostering enduring Christian commitment and hope, even in the midst of this kind of adversity, pressure, and pressure simply because of one's Christian commitment, so sustaining faith under pressure. This little screen shows you that this theme of suffering as a Christian in the world, it appears in every chapter in 1 Peter. So it's in chapter 1, it's in chapter 2, it's in chapter 3, it's in chapter 4, it's in chapter 5. So the thread runs all the way through. And we'll look at these, each of them briefly to see how 1 Peter addresses this. I hope I don't leave you feeling anguished and suffering at the end of this session. We'll try to get the hope. So 1 Peter 1, verses 6 and 7. In this you rejoice, even if now, for a little while, you have had to suffer various trials, so that the genuineness of your faith, being more precious than gold, that though perishable is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed. Kind of links back to your comment about Chinese, underground Chinese Christians a few years ago. Well, how does the author here help us to make sense of the reality of suffering? What's the wisdom here? How do we make sense of this experience?
The refining of a precious metal.
So we go to some metallurgy, and I'm not a metallurgist, so I don't know about the precision of the analogy here, the metaphor, but this is a purification, right? There's a purification process. I mean, that's one way of thinking about suffering. Maybe it's not all that far removed from what Paul was saying in Romans 5, and endurance and character is the result of the experience, or is possibly the result of the experience of suffering. How long does suffering last according to this? Is it forever?
No.
So for a little while. So the experience of suffering is temporary, the author says. You see that? It's a way of helping the hearers of the letter hang in there, right? Because it's not going to be the end point. It's what they're experiencing. Now, the end point, rather, will be a sharing, participation in the glory, the honoring of God. So from the start, the author gives us some perspective on suffering that is not ultimate. It's not forever, it's not ultimate, and it's not the last word about us. Now another passage in chapter 2, and here it's one of at least 3 places in the New Testament letters where the author will pick up particular roles and relations within the household in that culture, in that time. So here, addressing slaves, there were some early Christian people, followers of Christ, who were slaves in their households. We know from Paul's letter to Philemon that in some cases the master had become Christian too. So this is going to force some rethinking, right, about how we relate to one another. What Paul tries to help Philemon see is that his slave Onesimus, who's with him now in jail, is now more than a slave. He's a brother. He's a brother in Christ. So the process of reimagining, revisioning these relationships, it's beginning, but it's going to take a while. But you might have Christian slaves also, and I think that's what 1 Peter is assuming. So part of the Christian group who are slaves, but their masters are not. Their masters are not Christ believers. So how do you negotiate that? Slaves, 1 Peter says, accept the authority of your masters with all deference. Not only those who are kind and gentle, but also those who are harsh. For it is a credit to you if, being aware of God, you endure pain while suffering unjustly. If you endure when you are beaten for doing wrong, what credit is that? But if you endure when you do right and suffer for it, you have God's approval. For to this you've been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin, no deceit was found in his mouth. When he was abused, he did not return abuse. So we're thinking about the cross, the crucifixion, as a pattern here. Did not seek vengeance or retaliation. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but he entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. Now, how's the author trying to give us some perspective on the experience of suffering for our faith? Are we squirming a little bit on this one?
Mm-hmm.
Think we should? Think we should? Yeah.
I just think a little bit about maybe even this one more, the Christians being slaves and their owners not being, is in the workplace when, the coach that wants to have prayer with his team for and loses his job.
Or your boss, your supervisor, who insists that you do something that you know is wrong, but you know that your job might be at risk if you don't. So right, to think about the master-slave relationship and then to translate it into roles that are more part of our immediate experience is helpful. So how do you live out of integrity? How do you live out of your faith as a Christian when you are in a position of lower power, right? Less power, and you're being told to do something that you don't think is right. So it's a way of putting ourselves into the situation here. Obviously, the harshness, the difficulty of the passage is something we struggle with today and should struggle with today. Is it the case that the person with less power in a situation should simply submit to abuse that's thrown at him or her? I mean, would we really say that 1 Peter would be okay with a domestic abuse situation where a child or a spouse is victim of verbal or physical abuse? You can see how this passage could be used that way, and I think that would be horrific. So what we need to bring ourselves back to the original context that we're talking about is people who have become Christ followers. Now we have the extreme example of those who are in a household where they are really subject to the will and power of their master. How can they do that faithfully? How can they do that faithfully? And so there's some reassurance that given. The slave can't free himself. So how's the slave going to manage this? There's some assurance given. Christ is there ahead of you. Christ also has suffered. And yet he trusted God. So how do we trust God? How do we entrust our lives to God even when we're in such a no-win situation as that? Well, let's move on, but we need to grapple with the difficulty of that text. Now here, Peter, actually there's a lot of connection between Peter and Paul's theology. But Peter, in chapter 3, will draw more general strokes. Who will harm you if you're eager to do what is good? But even if you do suffer for doing what is right, you are blessed. Don't fear what they fear. Don't be intimidated, but in your heart sanctify Christ as Lord. That's your real master, Christ. Always be ready to make your defense to anyone who demands from you an accounting for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and reverence. Keep your conscience clear so that when you are maligned, so again, think about folks in Roman society who have been publicly identified as Christian and all the suspicions and antagonism and hostility that results. How are you to live? Make clear when you're maligned, those who abuse you for your good conduct in Christ may be put to shame. So the shame is going to be on them, not on you. If suffering, for it is better to suffer for doing good, if suffering should be God's will, than to suffer for doing evil. For Christ also, so then again we come to the pattern, the example of Christ. For Christ also suffered for sins once for all, the righteous for the unrighteous, in order to bring you to God. He was made alive was put to death in the flesh, made alive in the spirit. Here's a strong urging to the community to live well, to make the right decisions, in their conduct, to show through their virtue, their good lives, that any criticism, any harassment, any persecution is undeserved. So 1 Peter's not saying go and seek out suffering, right? It's not a call to masochism. Don't seek out suffering. Live faithfully. Live by the right that you know. And if in our world that brings suffering, trust your life to God, right? So in a context where being a good, faithful Christian means to be persecuted, don't seek out the persecution, but do what is right, even if it means experiencing suffering. And then he continues in chapter 4 with this theme, reinforces it, this fiery ordeal taking place among you. Shouldn't be surprised by that. Rejoice insofar as you share Christ's suffering. So again, a third time he's connecting our suffering as Christ's people to Christ's own suffering, so that you may be glad and shout for joy when his glory is revealed. So our suffering is on the way to our sharing in glory. If you're reviled for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory, which is the Spirit of God, is resting on you. But let none of you suffer as a wrongdoer, as a criminal, and so on. So make clear by the good life that you're living that your suffering is undeserved. Right? So if you think about the Beatitudes in Matthew, right? Blessed are you when you're persecuted. Similar sort of emphasis. So let us, suffering in accordance with God's will, entrust ourselves to a faithful Creator while continuing to do good. And then the last passage in chapter 5 connects our experience of suffering with the suffering of other people of faith in the world. We're not alone in this. We are kin, brothers and sisters with other people of faith who also are suffering. And again returns to this point that the suffering is just for a little while. The suffering is not permanent. Suffering is temporary. And what is ultimate and what is lasting, what is permanent, is our sharing in the honor, in the glory of God. Now, I think the real challenge of reading 1 Peter, and it's come out already, right, is this a call to embrace suffering and victimhood? It's been read that way by some, and it's dangerous. If it's read that way, it's harmful if it's read that way. Does a person with greater power, whether an employer with respect to an employee, a coach with respect to athlete, etc., does that one who has a greater power have sanction, have permission to misuse that power? Does the person in the lower position, the employee, the athlete, the child, the spouse, have to simply become a doormat and get walked on and just take it? It's been used that way. Again, what I think it's important to do is place ourselves in the context of the author and those first readers. They are trying to figure out how, in an increasingly pressured, hostile, antagonistic society, how to be Christ's people. And should they continue courageously and boldly to identify publicly as Christ's people, or should they make the suffering go away by either being quiet about their faith or simply abandoning their commitment? So the author's encouragement is to be faithful, is to continue in your commitment, trusting in God, acknowledging, we know that it might mean it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard. But persevere, be faithful. God will honor you. So some challenging words and some tough questions. Let me stop with that and see if we, have some wisdom and some questions in the group. Yes, Rutherford.
The question that gets raised for me as polite and well-mannered Presbyterians is, are we ready to express the hope that is in us at all?
Yeah.
To express our own faith with reverence and gentleness.
Yes. So, and I think that's a question to us in our own context. How do we do that faithfully? Are there points that at which it would mean pressing against sort of the way the culture is, the society is? And